Hello and welcome to the Django DRF project, eCommerce. This tutorial is part of a series of tutorials which you can watch for free. The link to the YouTube course playlist is in the video description. This course is also available on Udemy, where you can watch the course ad-free, download the tutorial source code, and access all updated tutorials and playlist. The link to the course, which will always provide the best price, can be found in the video description. Hopefully now, if you have viewed the previous tutorials, we now have learned a little bit about testing and creating some unit tests. So now we're going to move on to the idea of end-to-end testing, utilizing the API client. Now, traditionally, testing in Django, we would utilize the test client, which is a Python class that acts as a dummy web browser. Now, we aren't interacting with our Django project in a traditional sense, in that we're not requesting web pages to be returned back to our browser. Here we're developing an API. So here we have slightly different rules in regards to how we interact with our application. But here in the Django Rest Framework, we have the API client, which extends from the existing client class, but provides the support and the tools that we need to interact with our application like we might do from a front-end application. Let's go into our project and we'll go into our test folder and product. So this is going to be a test related to the product app. So inside of here, let's go ahead and add a new file. Let's call this test. It could be test E2E, could be, for example, endpoints. That's what we're essentially going to be testing here. Some of the API endpoints. So let's call it test_endpoints. So let's just remind ourselves of the endpoints that we have in our system. So we'll go ahead and just start the server up again. And take a look, just remind ourselves of how to access the documentation. So back in our browser here, we go to the loopback address. Not too sure why that's there. Loopback address. And then if you remember, it was /API/ and then schema, and then docs. So that was the link to our documentation. You can see here we have 4 endpoints, well, 3 endpoints: brand, category, and product. Let's start as we did in the previous testing file. Let's go ahead and create a class for each of our models, for example. So class, let's call this test category endpoints. So we only have 1 endpoint per model at the moment, and no doubt that will scale as we develop further. So let's just do the same thing here for all of our models. There we go. So test category, test brand, and then test the product. Okay, so that nicely organizes should we have many different endpoints related to these different models, for example. So now let's go ahead and create an endpoint test for example, let's start with the category. So let's go ahead and specify the endpoint. We'll do that manually. So let's say, for example, endpoint, and let's specify that. So it's API/ and then schema, and then, oh no, sorry, the endpoint. Let's start that again. So API, if you're not too sure, which I've actually just forgotten, it's just API, then category, and so on. Okay, right, so API category. So that's our endpoint, right? So we want to test this endpoint. Right, so here we're essentially just preparing the data. Now we can go ahead and create. Now we can specify what it is that we want to test. So let's define our endpoint for this. This is going to be /API/, in this case it's category. If you're not too sure, check out your documentation. That's why we built it. So yeah, it's just here, that's the endpoint. Let's add a / onto the end. Now let's build a function which we can then go ahead and test this endpoint. So we're going to test, we'll call this category, test category endpoint. There we go. Right, or test category and then define the interaction. So in this case, it could be get. So we send a get request. That's what it says here. This is accessed via get request, this data. So we could utilize that alternatively. Let's type in self here. And let's now think about now building our tests. Now, what we ought to do here is remember this endpoint. What is it for? So at the moment, we've generated a very simple endpoint, which would return, if we take a look at our views, forgotten, essentially just grabs all the categories and then returns all the categories in a nice little list. That's what this endpoint is for at the moment, a simple view set for viewing all categories. So with that in mind, we probably need to actually have some data in the database, right? So let's go ahead and actually add some data into the database. And of course, we've already made our factories in the previous tutorial. So if we follow what we created earlier, so we know how to access our category factory. So let's do that. And let's go ahead and just access our category factory. So we might think of this process as kind of a range. We'll get everything ready. So what's happening here then is that we are initiating our factory. It's then going to create a new category in the test database, remember. So now we can go ahead and act. So let's go ahead and actually build a request. So let's go for response equals, and now we're going to bring in the API client. Okay, API client. We're going to need to set this up shortly because at the moment it's not referring to anything. And then we're going to use the get method from the API client. And then we just need to specify what we want to get. So we've specified our endpoint up here. So self.endpoint. So self is giving me access, if you're not familiar with self and classes, etc. This is giving me then access through self to the endpoint variable here in this kind of global area of our class. So let's imagine that everything is okay there, and we now have made a request. We've gathered the data as if we were to make an API request to this endpoint. So you would imagine at this point we've added some data to the database so it would return one object. So here we're going to assert. So what do we need to do here? So what we can do is a very simple response. So typically when we create a request, we return a response. Regardless whether it fails or whether it's successful, typically we would get a response of some sort. Then that response would have behind the scenes a status code of some sort, if you're familiar to HTTP kind of status codes and such. So we know that the status code, if it returns a 200, it typically means that it was successful, our request, and we have returned data. So we can go into, remember, our request has returned into this variable response. So inside of here, there's a range of different data, and one of the data points that we can access is the status code. So that information is inside of our response, and that should respond, if successful, to 200. So this assert is checking to ensure that our request was successful. As I mentioned in the preview, the API client is the key here. This is what is going to act as a kind of dummy client and actually send the request, in this case a get request, to the endpoint and handle that response. And you can see that that then is all stored in the response variable. So now we can introduce the Pytest fixture. So a Pytest fixture, let's think of it as a function which we can then make available to other tests. So these functions may provide data for testing and an other wide range of values or resources that our tests might need. So here we're going to create a fixture for our API client, and that's going to provide us a way of avoiding us having to type the same code out multiple times within our tests. So we write out once, and then we can include that resource in any test that we need. So first of all then, let's go back into our test we're inside the comp test file here. So let's go ahead and import the API client. So we'll find that from the REST framework. We're going to find that in our test suite here, import API client. Okay, there we go. So let's now create a fixture, really simple. So this is going to be a Pytest fixture. So Pytest fixture. Let's build then the function. So you can see it's just declaring our function client. And then let's go ahead and return API client. Okay, so you can see that we're going to need to import Pytest as well. So let's do that. And there we go. So there we have it. So that will now be available. Remember, the conf-test file will be read before we run tests. So this fixture will then be available, let's say globally, for other tests to utilize. So let's go back to the endpoint tests here. Now we need to make that available. So within our test, let's call the API client. Let's make that available. And you can now see we've resolved the error that we had before. So we're now ready to test this out. So just as a reminder, remember we're going to create a new category. We're going to then test the endpoint that we specified up here at the top. And then we're going to test to check to see if it was successful by utilizing the codes, the status codes that are generated depending on the type of response that we receive. So a 200 response typically identifies a good, a positive, a successful return of data. Should you need to read more about status codes, then I find that the developer.mozilla website is typically the best resource for that. You can see here there are multiple codes to familiarize yourself with. Now, I don't recommend you read through all of these codes, but this is definitely a resource to look at should you have any problems and need to look up a number. Let's now try this out. So let's bring up the terminal. Let's close the server and clear. So let's run Pytest. Give it a go. You can see that we have one failed test. Okay, so you can see that the database is not allowed. That's what it's telling me down here because we've forgotten to give access to the database. So what we're going to need to do here is, like we did, let's import Pytest. It's getting a bit late now. I might make a few mistakes. Import Pytest, like we did previously. I'll just close those. Like we did previously, we brought in a global sense, the Django DB access. So let's do the same thing again. So that will then provide access to all of our tests here in this module to the Django database. So we should now be able to run the same test again. There we go. And here we have a passed test. And now you can see that because we have a different module with tests here, you can see we have the new file and the amount of tests that were run. So we run 3 tests in the previous testing file. And here we have 1 test so far in the endpoints. So everything is good to go at the moment. Now, obviously you can do a bit of sanity checking here. Maybe you want to change these numbers and you'll see that it probably will fail. So everything looks good so far. In addition to checking the status code, the response code that returns from our request, we can also take a look at the data, or we can test the data that is returned from our API request. Now, what we might want to do here, for example, is create some more data and then check to make sure that the correct amount of data is being returned. Previously, we created a factory. Now that factory, when we call the factory, will create 1 new record. Now we can extend that and create a batch. So we can create more than 1. Not a problem. So let's go ahead and create 4 new entries in our database. So now the category factory is going to generate 4 new records in our test database. Now we can go ahead and potentially test to ensure that we actually return 4 of our records. Now, the data that is returned in the response should be in the format of JSON. So what we need to do here is we're going to need to parse the JSON string that's returned from the response and then convert it into a Python dictionary. And then we can just go ahead and just count and the length, and that would then give us or indicate the amount of data that is returned from our response. Sorry, from our request. So let's give that a go. Let's assert, and now we want to utilize some of the JSON tools. So we're going to need to bring those in. So we're going to need to import JSON up the top here. So let's do that. So import JSON. Okay. And now at the bottom here, let's go ahead. So we're going to count the length of the list essentially. So we're going to use len for that if you're not familiar with that. So we'll bring in JSON. So we're going to use JSON loads, which is going to, like I said, parse our JSON into a Python list. And then what do we want to actually convert into our list? Well, that's just the response content. So that's where we're going to find the data that's returned from our request in the response and then the content. Right, so that should equal 4. Okay, so equals 4 because we created 4 new records in our database. So let's give this a go. Okay, so let's give that a go like that to begin with, and you can see that everything looks okay. If I were to change this number, let's take a look, and you can see that in actual fact it is returning 4, not 43. So everything looks okay at the moment. Now what we can do, if you're not too sure, let's go ahead and use a print here. So let's go ahead and just actually read what's being returned. So I'm going to copy and paste the JSON loads function into the print here. Now notice by default, it doesn't return anything here. So what we're going to need to do is utilize a flag. So you can see that I was playing around with the flags earlier. So the S flag here, that's going to give us some additional information. And it's going to kind of output the print here. You can see here, that's the output right here, and you can see what's happening here. We've created this nice list here with all the different categories that have been generated by our factory. Now notice that because we have added the name in a static way, we've hard-coded in the name, you can see that every category is called test category, which isn't necessarily the best way of working. So what we can do here in the factories, we can generate a sequence. So instead of hard coding something like that, maybe you want test brand, up here, category, test category 1, 2, 3, 4. So every time we utilize the batch and create a new record, it will add something a little bit more unique other than this static test category. So here we can add, for example, factory dot, and then we can use sequence, and then we can bring in a lambda function. So let's go ahead and utilize this. So let's, for example, add a category and then, for example, underscore them, then a number. So let's add a placement here for the number, and let's then go ahead and ensure that it increments. Right, so with that in place, let's try this again. Just double check this, underscore, here we go. Okay, so let's try this again and take a look at the output. So this time you notice starts from 0. So we have category 0, 1, 2, and 3. And that just makes a little bit more unique. Now we haven't actually specified in our model. If we go back to the models here, we haven't specified that the name needs to be unique, but we may need to do that because typically we won't want to have our category, we won't want to have 2 categories with the same name potentially. So let's set unique equals true here. And that will just ensure that we don't have 2 names that are the same. So let's go ahead and just test this once more. And you can see that everything is successful. So let's actually just take out the lambda. I'm just going to copy this and then just step back a few to where we started. Let's just see that in action. Gone back a bit too far. So let's just name equals. So let's name test category. So you don't have to do this, but just to show you the fact that potentially now, because we've added unique, this won't work. Now it looks like it's okay at the moment, and that's probably because we're going to need to make a migration here. So let's go ahead and add unique to the category name field. And let's go ahead and now make a migration. What am I doing? Okay. Let's wake up. migrations. There we go. Alter name, field name, yep. And then let's go ahead now and migrate. Okay. And let's now run Pytest again. And this time you can see that we do receive an error. So the unique constant failed. So we now have the unique in play. So let's go back to our factory. Let's just paste what we had in earlier. Let's try this again. There we go. So just to confirm, we've changed the unique, we added a unique constraint in the category models. And we've gone ahead and added a Lambda function here, utilizing a factory sequence so that we can generate unique names for our category. And we have now tested the endpoint, our category endpoint, both with the status code and also looking at returning a certain amount, a number of records from the database. Hopefully you're getting a basic understanding why this might be considered a end-to-end test, because remember, we're testing quite a lot here. We are simulating the idea that we are the client, API client. We're sending a request to the server. We're checking the URL. We're checking the view is working correctly, the view set. We're checking that interaction with the database, and we're checking also or testing the serializer as well, because the data returns, it needs to be serialized. And you can see that it's responding, and then we go ahead and convert that, check the length, and then we can test to make sure that we're returning the correct amount of data. Hopefully you're feeling confident now to actually replicate this code for both the test brand endpoints and the test product endpoints. Okay, so now we're just going to repeat essentially what we've done here for the test brand endpoint and the product endpoint. Not too sure why we've got this factory here. Let's remove that. Right, so let's go ahead and just copy this because the brand is going to be very similar, isn't it? Now at this point, we're just doing this just as an exercise or practicing typing code and learning the basics here of how we might want to interact with our endpoints and test them. Right, so we've got the API brand. One of the dangers of writing too many tests, particularly in the way that we're developing here, it's very, very fluid. We don't want to end up creating so many tests that when we want to make changes, and no doubt we will make changes to the code, you then have to spend more time actually then changing all the tests. So because, like I said, that we're going to make lots of changes, and again, in the context of what this course is meant to be as a kind of a learning aid, we will make many changes. And so we don't want to overburden ourselves with having to do too much work, particularly at the start. Maybe towards the end of the project, we'll have a much better idea of what it is we're going to develop, and we can build more tests then. But at the moment, I'm just concentrating on trying to give you a little bits of information, which will then build up to hopefully so you feel confident actually building your own tests. Anyway, let's get back here. Right, so we're going to need the category, we're going to need the brand factory, right? So we're bringing API client as per normal. We're going to need the brand factory this time. So we'll go ahead and create a batch, say 4. We've got the response, status code, so everything else is going to be the same there. Let's give that a go. Now, I don't think the brand name needs to be unique either. So that is probably something else we need to actually specify as unique. And that's quite handy because as we work through, we're learning more about our data. So let's add that into the brand, and we're probably just going to need to make migrations and then migrate. Press up because they were commands we used recently. So I have migrated that. So the brand now is or should be unique. So let's go back into our factories. Let's go back into our sequence for our name. Let's go ahead and add that to the brand. So let's just say brand here instead. So that's our sequence for our brand. Step 2. And I think that's just about it for that. So let's go for Pytest. There we go. Looks like everything is working okay. So now let's concentrate on the endpoint for the product. It's going to be very similar, I think, here. So let's just copy and paste that down into the product. Okay, line everything up. If you're not familiar with Python, the white space is going to be really important. The indentation is going to be really important. So here we're going to utilize product. Here we've got test product get. Did I change that? Yep. Oh, no, I didn't. So let's change the name to brand in the previous function name. So here we've got the product factory this time. So I wonder if there's any differences that we're going to need to deal with here for that, because I wonder if there's any unique fields. Right, so response. So we've got the response, status code, blah, blah, blah. Everything else is pretty much the same there. Let's go into our factory. Okay, so do we want to have products that might have the same name? Well, that is a decision that you're probably going to need to make. I'm not going to make that unique at this point, the product name. Description, digital, true, brand. So everything else can just stay the same at this point. But that is something that maybe needs consideration. Should you have two products that have the same name? Yeah, that's something maybe to consider. Right. So with that in place, apologies, let's go back to the endpoint here. So we've got the product factory, product batch. Okay, let's give this a go. And there we go. Everything seems to be working absolutely fine. That leaves us now with testing potentially our serializers, maybe the URLs, although we're using a router in this scenario. And also we could also unit test our view sets. Now I've decided not to do that at this point because we're going to make quite a lot of changes to particularly maybe our serializers and view sets. And it gives us an opportunity to slowly introduce these other types of tests that we can perform as we move through the project.